like to speak to us this morning from the theme, You the Man, You the Woman. Typically when we hear that shout coming from the crowd, it's usually a shout of affirmation. It's usually a shout of exaltation, saying that you have excelled, that you have achieved, you are the best. But I was stunned to find that the prophet Nathan was the first one to utter that phrase. But when he uttered that phrase to David, saying, you are the man, it was not uttered in appreciation for his stellar achievement, but it was spoken in condemnation for the grotesque, outrageous crime and sin that David had committed. I love how this story, this really, truly work of art, as Walter Brueggemann, the great Hebrew scholar, puts it, that this entire story, and again, I don't give you homework every Sunday, but this is homework this time. Please read the whole story of David, Bathsheba, Nathan, and Uriah that you'll find in chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel. You'll not be able to put it down. But how it's such a powerful work of art that the writer is able to sum up this whole event in this one sentence and in these few words. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. The thing that David has done. That's got to be the greatest understatement in the entire Bible. For the thing was lying, deceit, rape, and murder, all rolled up into one sordid series of events. So let me rehearse the thing that David did, just in case you missed that Sunday in Sunday school. Now, they might not have included it in Sunday school. It's a little bit racy, maybe youth group. Now, although the story has been known throughout history as an adulterous act, when we listen to it with modern ears, we hear it a bit differently. The story goes like this. It was a time that kings went out to war. It was a time for war. Even we have heard how our own armies kind of wait, whether they're in Afghanistan or in Iraq, for the spring to come because that's the time of war. And the kings go out to war, and even David was known among Israel as a warrior king. So he was often on the battlefront. And in his coming up and displacing of Saul, the crowd sang to David, Saul has killed his 1,000, but you have killed 10,000. He was such a great warrior king. But this spring, this season of war, David abdicated his responsibility. He sent the troops into the battlefield, but he stayed home. That's the first wrong, abdicating his duty. And so while he was back at home and lounging in his palace, he looked out the window onto the roof of a home not too far for his keen eyes to spy. And he saw a young woman bathing. And his fancy, his lust rose, and he sent his soldiers, his officers, to retrieve her. And they went to her house and said, the king wants you. And they brought her to David in his palace. And the text says David lay with her. And then he sent her back. He was done with her. He was done with her and threw her back and gave it not another thought. Until word came from this woman that he'd probably forgotten about. She sent a message that had just 2 words in it. He opened up the message, and the word said, "I'm pregnant." David wasn't the first and not the last whose world was turned upside down by those 2 words, "I'm pregnant." So even for the king, while he thought he could do his private dirty, he could not be exposed as having committed such a heinous act. And so he thought he could cover it up by sending for Bathsheba's husband, who was a loyal and faithful soldier. They call him Uriah the Hittite. And he sent word to the front and said, "Bring Uriah home." And Uriah returned, and he inquired of Uriah, "How is the war going?" But it was all a ruse just to get Uriah back from the front. And then he would send him home, says, "Go home to your wife and to your house and go wash your feet," which was just a wink-wink euphemism for to enjoy the comforts of home with your wife. You've been away for months on the battlefield. He expected Uriah to take advantage of that opportunity, sleep with his wife, go back to the front, and when word comes that she's pregnant, he'll think it's his. And this is where the art just gets so wonderful and so powerful. So you have this absolutely corrupt king, high and mighty and powerful, and this absolutely incorruptible soldier peon on the front. So even though the king has brought him home, even though the king has sent him to his house with his wife, Uriah refuses to go into his home, refuses to lay in bed with his wife because his comrades are out on the battlefield. And I dare not enjoy the comforts of home while my comrades are on the battlefield. So he slept on the doorstep of the king's palace. When his ruse failed, he sent Uriah back into battle and gave message to the general to set Uriah at the front and then withdraw that he might be killed. That was his next cover-up. And when that ruse succeeded and Uriah was dead, he brings Bathsheba into his house as his wife. And she bears the child that he claims now as his own. That's the thing that David did. You know, there is so much wrong with this story. I could preach on this text for weeks, just detailing all the ways that David did Uriah wrong and did Bathsheba wrong and did the nation wrong. But I just want to make these points. Number one, this episode is commonly referred to as an adulterous act, but this was not an act of adultery, it was an act of rape. 2, this story is not about sex, it is about power and privilege. 3, it is about David, but it is also about each and every one of us. 4, it is about sin and confession and forgiveness of sin and restoration. Number 1, this was a rape because Bathsheba had no power of her own. She had no voice. When you read the story, you'll find no words uttered by Bathsheba until those fateful words, "I'm pregnant." When the soldiers come to retrieve her, she doesn't say, "Oh, yes, I've been waiting for the king to call on me." She doesn't say anything. She has no voice, and therefore no power, and therefore no consent. There was no possibility of consent. Fortunately, our culture has evolved, and most of us understand rape as an abuse of power and not an act of lust or sex. Maybe the traditional understanding of this story as adultery is the false foundation for some right-wing Christians asserting that a woman cannot get pregnant from a rape. Rape is a violence that often uses no weapon, no visible weapon, and leaves no visible scars. But violence it is, and scarring it is. Number two, this story is not about sex. It is about power and privilege. The prophet Nathan, and this is where we get the idea of speaking truth to power. Nathan was a prophet, and that was an office in Israel that was well respected and well established, and the prophet could walk into the king's office and tell him the truth. But we do know of prophets who have been punished for that truth, but that was their call and that was their role. So Nathan walks in and he kind of couches the truth in this parable that was read about the lamb. But notice that when Nathan comes to condemn David, he does not tell him a parable about sex or adultery. No, it is about power. It is about, interestingly in the parable, income inequality. The kind of income inequality that we know today, where executive pay goes up by factors of 10, but minimum wage loses ground to inflation. The rich man with flocks and herds, has a visitor come by for lunch. And rather than to take just one lamb from his many herds, he sends and gets the one lamb of this poor man and slaughters it to feed his friend lunch. So this parable is an interesting choice by Nathan, and I think he's trying to shift our focus away from the salacious aspects of this story and to the more profound and deep aspects of this story. And so if we want to call it a rape, some just might say this is economic rape. The advantage that the rich and powerful have over the poor, that David had over Uriah and Bathsheba, and that the rich man in the parable had over the poor man with his one lamb. Some might call what happens today economic rape of workers whose single source of income is taken away, shipped away, innovated away, mechanized away, so that the CEO can entertain his friends using those resources rather than his own income from any of the several businesses that they own or the boards that they sit on. I read yesterday that the Koch brothers are convening their best friends and biggest donors to their political machine to review and examine the candidates for the 2016 round. And it said that they were meeting at a hotel in Dana Point. And it turns out that's the hotel where my son Marcus works. And he told me about all the security and the this and the that. He said they booked the entire hotel for this conference. It's closed to the public. And he's working there today, and Carly Fiorina is coming by to be interviewed, and Scott Walker's coming by to be interviewed. It won't cost the Koch brothers a dime. They'll put it all on their expense account. Nathan makes it clear with his choice of this particular parable. He makes it clear that this event is about inequality. Inequality between David and Bathsheba, and David and the immigrant, Uriah the Hittite. Uriah, who was more loyal to his adopted nation than that nation's own king. So loyal that he was on the front. He was fighting while the king was laying and lounging back at home. Uriah, who sacrificed his life that the war might be advanced. And in David's dastardly scheme, he not only killed Uriah, but killed other soldiers with him just to cover up his crime, just to cover up for an afternoon's excess. Yes, this story is about David, but it is also about us. We may not have committed rape. Well, they didn't call it rape when I was in college. But to whatever extent we have abused our power and exploited our privilege, we are David. To whatever extent our power and privilege supplied by the little ewe lambs of the poor, the undocumented, the underclass of the world, we are David. From our food to our clothes, to our Nike shoes and our Apple phones and our chip-powered computers, to the fossil fuels powering our cars and heating our homes, we are David. Ultimately, it is also a story about confession, leading to repentance, forgiveness, and grace. Confession is first, and confession is hardest. It's hard to look ourselves in the mirror and to look at the world's problems and own our piece of it. We are like David. We turn on the news, or we turn on CNN, or we turn on Fox, or we turn on MSNBC, and we rail at the news and how horrible, how terrible. Let me at him, let me at him. It's us. We have a piece of everything that boils our blood. So confession must come first. We must own our piece of it. We must hear Nathan in our own conscience saying to us, you the man, you the woman. Confession must come first. But David had a hard time with confession, and he kept covering up. David couldn't confess because he thought he would die. But Nathan finally assures him, God has put away your sin. You shall not die. While we believe we cannot confess because we think the guilt will kill us, kill our relationships, kill our families, kill our business model, kill our nation, kill our world as we know it. we yet must confess if we're ever going to change anything. And in order to do that, we need faith. We need faith that another world is possible. We need faith that we can confess and we will not die. We need faith to trust and to believe that God's grace is sufficient, that we can be blessed by the grace and mercy of a loving family, a hopeful community, and a just and loving God. Let the people of God say, amen.